Originally from Jamaica, Pamela Ballin and her husband Ricky started their marriage in the U.S.
Opportunity was here in the States.
And they had made the best of it.
She became a travel agent.
He eventually started his own business, which is a landscaping business.
And he eventually turned it into an empire.
$200,000, $300,000 jobs.
But after 25 years of marriage, just as they were finally enjoying their hard-earned success, it would all end in a night of terror.
Somebody's in the house.
Like someone burst into the home?
They found Ricky sprawled out on the floor with his head caved in.
Was it simply bad luck?
Everybody was just shocked and just in total disbelief.
Or did the couple's seemingly successful marriage mask a deadly secret?
Only 2 people in the house, then it must be the one that's alive.
Lithonia, Georgia, December 29, 2009. It was not quite 2:30 on a Tuesday morning in this sleepy country town turned sprawling Atlanta suburb.
It's got rural suburbia in some ways. It's got a lot of wide open spaces, plenty of families who are relatively well off.
At the time, I would say upper middle class.
And at 2:20 that morning, DeKalb County 911 received an urgent call from one of those upper middle class homes.
It's like somebody's in the house.
The woman reporting the intruder was 48-year-old Pamela Ballin.
She can hear noises, she can hear some type of struggle and commotion going on.
Tell me, where are you at in the house, ma'am?
In the closet.
You're in the closet?
I'm inside the closet.
But according to Pamela, her husband, 53-year-old Ricky Ballin, wasn't hiding with her. Instead, he'd fought with the intruder.
Where's your husband at, ma'am?
I don't know, right? Somebody was hitting on him.
Whoever it was, they had apparently left.
Do you still hear voices in the house?
No.
No?
No.
Pamela said she could still hear something, though.
What did you hear?
My husband calling for me.
Your husband calling for you?
She doesn't know where he is. She's scared. She thinks that something's happened to her husband.
She thinks I should go downstairs to my husband.
No, ma'am.
She wanted to go downstairs. I told her, wait.
Wait until the officer clears the location. Do you understand?
Pamela did as she was told, but even as she huddled in the closet, waiting for the police to arrive, she begged for the okay to help Ricky.
I need to go downstairs.
Stay where you are.
Finally, after several agonizing minutes, the officers reached Pamela's door.
The door was locked when the police originally got to the scene of the crime.
Stay on the phone with me and go and get the door.
Are you sure?
Yes, ma'am.
Still on the open line, Pamela left her hiding place and went downstairs to let police into the house.
Are you at the door, ma'am?
She breaks down. She's crying. She's distraught.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God.
And when Pamela let the police in, it was easy to see why.
There's blood everywhere.
Blood that came from Ricky, who lay just inside the door.
He sprawled out on the floor with his head caved in.
However, despite his horrible injuries, Ricky was still alive.
He's moaning. The police are trying to talk to him, but he's not really talking. He's not able to answer any of their questions. It's evident that he's in a very bad way.
And as the EMTs arrived and rushed Ricky to the hospital, the police would turn to Pamela to determine, was her husband the victim of a brutal home invasion? Or was there a deadly secret hiding inside the Ballin home?
Everybody was just shocked and just in total disbelief that this had happened.
Pamela Sinclair was born in 1961 on the island of Jamaica.
She grew up for the most part in Jamaica.
One of 6 children. There was never a dull moment in Pamela's childhood.
We've just always been very close, all of us.
Her side of the family, not just her sisters, they're always laughing and joking. It'd be like something you would see on a Tyler Perry movie.
But even in that crowded household, Pamela stood out.
Everyone loved my mother.
That's her personality. Very outgoing, friendly, easy to get along with.
And the same could be said of Derek Ballin, who first met Pamela in 1979. 5 years older than Pamela, Ricky Ballin was a gentle giant of a man.
He was 6'4", maybe 250, laid back, very nonchalant, very easygoing.
He was always the most pragmatic, level-headed dude.
Well, perhaps not always, because when he started dating Pamela, he was still involved with another woman, the mother of his son.
There was some turmoil. Ricky's first son, David's mother, was in the picture.
There was an overlap between my mother and my stepmother.
Although not for long.
My parents split when I was a kid.
And once he left his son's mother, Ricky appeared to devote himself to Pamela.
They were inseparable.
And once together, they were determined to make a fresh start in the United States.
Opportunity was here in the States.
And in 1984, after nearly 5 years together, Pamela and Ricky married and had a son.
I was actually born in Santa Maria, California.
Eventually, Pamela, Ricky, and their son settled in DeKalb County, Georgia, on the east side of Atlanta.
DeKalb is really, in many ways, kind of a melting pot.
Pamela found work at Atlanta's massive airport.
She became a travel agent when she got here.
Ricky, meanwhile, earned money and free dinner delivering pizzas.
He would bring home a pizza per night, she told me.
However, Ricky had come to America with bigger ambitions.
He eventually started his own business, which is the landscaping business.
That started with just your, run-of-the-mill residential grass cutting.
It was a small start, but Ricky was determined.
He would deliver pizzas at night, work during the day.
Meanwhile, Pamela worked full-time and took care of the couple's son.
My mother kind of had to deal with a lot.
Including her stepson, who had immigrated to America with his mother.
My mom moved to Boston, so I grew up in Boston primarily.
But he did remain close to his father.
I spent most of my summers in Georgia.
And thanks to that, David grew closer to Pamela, too.
I spent a lot of time with my stepmother. We had a very good relationship.
While Pamela focused on the kids, Ricky concentrated on the company. And throughout the 90s, as suburban Atlanta boomed, so did his business.
People knew that they can always call him to get a job done, and it would be done right.
He was well thought of.
He got to a point where, he didn't have to deliver the pizzas anymore.
In fact, what had started as a one-man operation went well past that point.
He went from one push mower to 6, 7 trucks, having his own office with his own space. He was living the American dream.
Ricky wasn't the only one living the dream either. Thanks to the success of his lawn care business, the immigrant family was soon enjoying the perks of a comfortable middle-class American life.
We go Disneyland in California, all over the Caribbean, Aruba, Mexico, Jamaica. My mother liked to keep us busy. Fun times.
Pamela and Ricky were also able to buy a beautiful home in the Atlanta suburb of Lithonia.
This area is a very nice area, a very well-developed area.
You get a lot more bang for your buck in terms of house size and lot size.
We had a basketball court in the back of my house.
And gorgeous landscaping out front.
It was, of course, landscape professional, so it stood out in the neighborhood.
Although by then, Ricky's company had grown beyond mere residential landscaping.
He worked a lot with commercial real estate. They did big jobs, like a lot of money's coming in.
He built a landscaping empire.
And just like his landscaping jobs, the office work to maintain his empire was no longer a one-person operation.
The business expanded to a level that needed someone else to come in.
He was not good at the bookkeeping and the finances and collecting.
But they were skills that Pamela had honed well, thanks to all her years as a travel agent.
He wanted her to come in and help him with the business.
Just handle any of the day-to-day affairs.
Pamela quit her job and started working in the office with Ricky. And before long, it appeared as if their collaboration would pay off.
Where my dad before was doing $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 jobs, it became $200,000, $300,000 jobs.
And by 2009, after more than 2 decades in America, Ricky was a proud example of immigrant success.
He didn't have anything handed to him. Coming from another country into a new culture and so on and so forth, I mean, he had the odds stacked against him and just persevered through it.
Not that he'd done it alone. Pamela deserved a lot of the credit, too.
She was a part of the sacrifices and building the business.
Some of the struggles, early on kind of did bring them closer together.
But at the end of 2009, a shocking crime would tear the couple violently apart. Early on the morning of December 29, 2009, police in Lithonia, Georgia, responded to a 911 call from the suburban Atlanta home of Pamela and Ricky Ballin.
Somebody's in the house.
Like someone burst into the home?
According to 48-year-old Pamela, her husband Ricky had fought the intruder and lost.
She's hearing what she believes to be her husband moaning.
When police arrived at the scene, they found 53-year-old Ricky Ballin sprawled just inside the door, covered in blood.
He just obviously had been in a fight.
He's on the ground, bleeding profusely from the head.
He's alive. He's moaning.
And if the first responders were going to save his life, they would have to act fast.
They call EMS. Ricky is taken away.
As Ricky was rushed to the hospital, Pamela begged the police at the scene to let her accompany her husband of more than 20 years.
She keeps asking them, how's my husband? I've got to go to my husband. She's crying, she's upset.
Despite her urgent pleas, the police refused Pamela's request. Since Ricky was in no shape to identify his attacker, they needed her.
The police officers basically tell her she's got to stay there at the scene and answer their questions.
She was the person who was in the house when the assault took place. And so naturally, they'd want to get her account of what happened.
And when she sat down with the investigators at the scene to give her statement, Pamela vowed to do everything she could to help them catch the intruder.
She's fully cooperative and forthcoming. There is nothing that they put to her that she does not answer.
According to Pamela, the night before had been like any other. When she got home from the gym, Ricky was in his favorite chair, surfing the internet on his phone.
He's kind of dozing off.
Pamela said Ricky was still in the recliner when she went to bed.
She takes a shower and goes to sleep.
And she told the investigators that Ricky still hadn't come to bed when she got up to go to the bathroom at around 2 o'clock in the morning.
She assumes he's in the bathroom. So she goes out of her bedroom into the guest bathroom.
While she's in the bathroom, she starts to hear noises.
It was Ricky, according to Pamela, and he sounded alarmed.
She heard him calling out, "Who are you? What are you doing here?"
What the intruder said, if anything, Pamela wasn't sure. But according to her, there was no mistaking what her husband had said next.
Pamela, get the gun.
Pamela said Ricky's request had apparently touched off a struggle.
She heard some loud crashes, things falling, possibly people hitting the walls.
Pamela said that the sound of fighting had sent her into a panic.
Instead of going to get the gun, she gets scared and, locks herself in the bathroom.
Soon after, according to Pamela, the struggle downstairs had apparently stopped.
She runs back into the bedroom. She grabs the phone that's on the nightstand.
And then, when she heard the intruders downstairs ransacking the house, Pamela said she had ducked into the bedroom closet and hid.
Based on what she heard, she believed it to be more than one person that was in the house.
At that point, Ms. Ballin, is legitimately terrified.
Too terrified to even risk dialing 911, according to Pamela.
She doesn't know how long she was hiding. It could have been 2, 3, 4 minutes, could have been 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to her.
However long it was, Pamela said the noises had finally died down. The intruders had apparently left.
The only reason She believed that she was untouched just because she hid.
And according to Pamela, it was only then, when she finally felt safe enough to dial 911, that she had suddenly heard a new noise coming from downstairs. Her husband moaning in pain.
My husband is calling for me.
Your husband calling for you?
Based on Pamela's story, it appeared that Ricky was the victim of a random robbery that had suddenly gone violently wrong.
There were a lot of home invasions around that time.
But that didn't make the news any easier on his family.
The saddest day of our lives. You know, we had been pretty much rocked by this terrible occurrence.
Even worse, just as Pamela finished telling her story to investigators, her cell phone suddenly rang. It was the hospital, and they had some urgent news for Pamela.
If you want to see your husband alive again, you better get to the hospital now.
She told the cops she's not staying there any longer. She's leaving. She needs to go to see her husband.
While Pamela rushed to her husband's bedside, the investigators took a closer look at the Ballin's home. And what they found appeared to match Pamela's story perfectly, from the pry marks on the back door frame.
There's a very clear mark that looked to be signs of forced entry to the house.
To the thoroughly ransacked interior.
There's furniture everywhere. There are drawers emptied. There is a Christmas tree that has been knocked over.
It just looked like, you know, a whirlwind came through.
Even the master bedroom was in shambles. To the investigators, it appeared to add up to a robbery.
It's clear that someone has been looking for something.
It was equally clear that Ricky had fought hard with the intruders.
There was blood everywhere. A gaping hole in the sheetrock, in the wall, basically, that, you know, is consistent with somebody swinging and missing.
You can also see some blood stains that are right next to those holes in the wall.
That was not just a quick deal. It was an actual barehanded fight.
But if it started barehanded, it looked as if Ricky's attacker had eventually picked up a weapon.
There is a statue, there's some decorative pieces there in the house that's laying in that area.
Ricky's wounds further confirmed Pamela's statement that her husband had fought with his attacker.
Ricky had defensive wounds on him. He had some sort of puncture wound on his forearm. He had a finger that was broken.
But his struggle had ultimately been in vain.
Ricky has suffered some tremendous and some significant injuries.
He'd been struck multiple times with a heavy object.
He's got about 10 or so gashes in his head.
And when Pamela arrived at the ICU, the doctors gave her the horrible news. Her husband's head injuries had done irreparable damage.
There was no possibility for him to ever regain a normal life.
He's going to be a vegetable for the rest of his life.
And with her husband essentially brain dead, it was up to Pamela to determine just how long the rest of his life would be.
She tells the doctor he wouldn't want to live like this.
Pamela and Ricky's son, Derek, who had joined her at the hospital, agreed.
They had to make a decision to take him off life support.
Probably the hardest decision I've had to make in my life.
Then, with his wife and son at his bedside.
About 10 o'clock that morning, Ricky passes.
We were in the room until the doctor made that declaration that he was gone.
Ricky was gone, but the authorities were just getting started. They were no longer investigating a home invasion. They were trying to solve a murder. On December 29, 2009, 48-year-old Pamela Ballin's husband, Ricky, died in a downtown Atlanta hospital, the apparent victim of a home invasion robbery.
Someone, for whatever reason, came into the house and got into a physical altercation with my father.
He was beaten to death in his home.
The 53-year-old had lingered brain dead for several hours before Pamela and her son Derek made the difficult decision to take him off life support.
Best case scenario for my father at that point was a vegetative state that he would never come out of.
News of Ricky's death and the home invasion that had apparently caused it shocked the Ballin's neighbors in the middle-class Atlanta suburb of Lithonia.
A lot of people were fearful, feeling like if it can happen to Ricky, it can happen to anybody.
But the investigators weren't quite so sure. To them, everything about the crime suggested that Pamela and Ricky's house had been specifically targeted.
Burglaries very seldom happen when people are home. They're not random for the most part.
And even though the house had been torn apart, it seemed like the thieves had been more interested in murder than money.
They didn't take no TV. They didn't take anything.
It just didn't add up.
But who would have wanted the local businessman dead?
He was very well loved within the community.
I've never met a person that had any kind of an issue with him.
The first clue lay in the condition of the crime scene. At first glance, it appeared to confirm Pamela's account of a break-in and a fight between Ricky and the intruder.
There were significant pry marks, and there's pictures of that where somebody got in.
Chairs turned over, there's blood splatter in a lot of different places. Just very consistent with a struggle going throughout the house.
But when police took a closer look, they noticed something strange in the Ballin's living room.
The Christmas tree was on the floor, but the ornaments on the Christmas tree weren't broken.
In fact, none of the overturned furniture had been damaged.
It was gently turned over. It appeared to have been placed there as opposed to knocked over.
All these things were just placed in certain areas to look like the things were disrupted.
And the pry marks on the door, didn't they at least prove that someone had entered the house from outside? Once the investigators got a better look at those marks in the daylight, they started to suspect that the marks hadn't been made with a crowbar or a screwdriver at all. Instead, they believed the scratches on the door had been made with a butter knife that was found on a nearby patio table.
To try to almost fake like there was some kind of entry.
And after dismissing the pry marks, they could find no other evidence suggesting that anyone had broken into the Ballin's home.
None of the doors were open. None of the windows were broken. Nothing.
As far as the investigators were concerned, the lack of forced entry and the careful, deliberate way the house had been ransacked could only add up to one thing.
The scene was staged.
And the investigators believed there was only one person who'd had the opportunity to stage it: Pamela.
They just automatically zeroed in on Miss Ballin.
The doors were locked and only 2 people in the house. Then it must be the one that's alive.
It would also explain Pamela's miraculous escape from the alleged home invaders.
They didn't walk into that bathroom. They checked every single room in that house except for the one place she was hiding. That didn't make any sense.
All but convinced that Ricky's murder had been an inside job, the investigators decided to take a closer look at his relationship with Pamela.
They're looking at phone records. They're talking to individuals who know Ricky, who know Pamela.
And according to friends and neighbors, everything appeared to be fine.
They were well established here in the community.
They were relatively well-to-do. He had a pretty successful landscaping business.
And their marriage appeared just as successful.
They were just always very loving. Everything that they did together.
Although according to her family, the more her husband's business grew, the more Pamela had felt neglected.
My father at that point was getting home a little bit late, right at dark.
And when he got home, according to Pamela's sister, he would do exactly what he had done the night before his murder: plop down in front of the TV until he had dozed off.
Ricky didn't want to go out. He didn't want to do anything. He just wanted to go to work 15, 20-hour days.
So feeling ignored at home, Pamela had eventually found the attention she needed from someone else.
She had an affair.
According to the family, Ricky had eventually found out about Pamela's infidelity.
He knew about it.
And at first, the family said he had been furious with Pamela.
He was very jealous.
But they also claimed that Ricky had eventually forgiven Pamela, at least partially blaming himself for what she had done.
There was always a level of guilt on his end.
And according to Ricky's son, the couple had eventually come to an uneasy peace.
They've been trying to work through it.
But then, in 2009, the family said that Pamela had committed what Ricky considered an unforgivable sin. According to the family, the trouble started not long after Ricky let Pamela take over the finances of his landscaping company.
The money came in, he didn't pay attention to it. He let her control the money.
He did at least look at the books periodically. And not long after Pamela took over, he noticed something.
There was money missing.
Ricky had brought the issue up with Pamela, but the family said she told him not to worry.
She wouldn't even have a conversation about what she was doing with the money. She just brushed it off like, I'm using it for the business. And he's like, where? How? Show me, you know? And she didn't feel the need to do that.
At first, Ricky let it go at that. The amounts were small, and he shrugged it off with a little grumbling.
Ricky would complain that Pam was dipping into his accounts.
But according to the family, as the months passed, more and more money started disappearing to the point that it threatened the business.
He was unable to meet payroll and do the business anymore. There was just too much money missing.
Facing financial ruin, according to Ricky's family, he had decided there was only one thing left to do.
He had planned to leave her.
He planned to divorce her.
There was just so much turmoil that it was clear that the marriage was ending.
However, his family said that before Ricky had even been able to consult a lawyer and put the paperwork in motion, he had been murdered. The timing of Ricky's murder and the supposed divorce wasn't the only thing that struck the investigators as suspicious either. It all started after New Year's 2010, when the investigators took a closer look at Ricky's life insurance.
They got a copy of the insurance policy that proved how much it was for.
And when they went over the details of the policy, the investigators immediately noticed something.
Some months prior to the incident, there was an increase in the insurance policy.
A significant increase, one that raised the payout to $750,000. And every penny went to Pamela. Coupled with what they knew about the trouble in the marriage, the police had found what they considered to be a convincing motive.
They believed she had killed her husband for insurance money because he was going to leave her.
A $750,000 payoff, the affair, and the staged crime scene. The investigators figured they'd found Ricky's killer. However, they also had one serious problem. They had no physical evidence tying Pamela to the crime scene.
She doesn't have any blood on her body, on her face, her hands, nothing in her hair.
It would be miraculous if you were to bludgeon somebody to death, yet you wouldn't have any blood on you at all.
And then there was the question of just how Pamela managed to bludgeon her husband to death.
Ricky was a big guy. In contrast, Pamela was very petite. She's about 5'1", and so Ricky towered over her. There was a significant difference in the size of these two individuals.
Hoping for some answers, the investigators asked Pamela to come back down to the station at the beginning of February for another interview.
She voluntarily went to the headquarters. She didn't have to go, but she went, and she answered all their questions.
Although, as the hours in the interrogation room ticked by, it became clear that the investigators weren't looking for answers. They wanted a confession.
You hear the old adage that it's always the husband or the wife. And that's the mentality that they took at that point. So they asked her the same questions over and over again.
But no matter how much pressure the investigators put on Pamela, her answers were always the same.
Her story never changed.
There was a home invasion. To my knowledge, and to the best of her knowledge, that's exactly what happened.
But it was a story the investigators were no longer interested in.
They did not believe that it had been a true home invasion.
And despite the fact that they had no confession and virtually no physical evidence, on February 4th, the DeKalb County Police placed Pamela under arrest for murder. On June 9th, 2014, 53-year-old Pamela Ballin stood trial for the murder of her husband, Ricky. It had been 4.5 years since he had been beaten to death inside the couple's Lithonia, Georgia home, the victim of what Pamela claimed to be a home invasion.
It really threw me for a loop why they would just only be looking at her and no other options, no other scenarios, no other theories.
Pamela has no criminal history. She has no DUIs, nothing of that sort.
In fact, the defense was convinced that Pamela's lack of a criminal history, coupled with the circumstantial nature of the case, is why it took the prosecutors almost 5 years to bring her to trial.
I think that they recognized that they did not have the evidence.
As a result, she had spent the last 4.5 years in limbo.
Pamela Ballin had been out on bond since February of 2010.
Although even without a murder conviction, Ricky's family was convinced she had killed him.
Ricky's family institutes a wrongful death suit.
And while Pamela and Ricky's son stood by his mother,
at that time, it was just me and my mother trying to pick up the pieces.
her stepson David tried not to choose sides.
I started from a place where I didn't believe it was her. I moved to a place where, you know what, it could be her. I believed that I should be neutral.
In opening statements on June 9th, the prosecution argued that a pending divorce was the motive behind Ricky's murder.
The state took the opportunity in their opening statement to paint a picture that she had killed her husband for insurance money because she was mismanaging the finances of the business and because she was having an affair and he was going to leave her.
The prosecution was saying that our client basically wanted to kill her husband so she could be free to have her boyfriends and to spend money.
According to the prosecutors, Pamela had wanted revenge too, because since her arrest, they had uncovered evidence that Pamela wasn't the only one who'd been having an affair.
It came out in the courtroom that he had a girlfriend.
She was the last person that he had spoken to that evening.
In fact, the prosecutors suggested that might have been the final nudge that Pamela needed to carry out her plan on December 29, 2009.
She must have seen him texting his girlfriend on the phone, or she went through his phone and saw that he had texted a girlfriend.
And as her anger and rage began to boil, she had waited until Ricky had dozed off in his recliner, taken a decorative statue off a nearby table, and crept up behind her husband.
The state's theory was that Pamela took the statue and began beating him in the head while he was sitting in the recliner, thereby getting the jump on him.
According to the prosecutors, Pamela's surprise attack was how she had managed to both overcome her much larger husband and escape any injuries in the process.
There was no way for him to fight back. He was already incapacitated with the first few blows.
Then, while Ricky lay dying on the foyer floor, the prosecutors claimed that Pamela had cleaned herself up, carefully trashed their home, and then called the police.
They alleged she was the one who staged this elaborate, break-in, armed robbery, home invasion type scenario.
It sounded logical, except for one nagging thing.
They had not presented any physical evidence linking her to the assault. Zero.
Their case basically was all circumstantial.
And because of that, when it was the defense's turn to start presenting its arguments, they opened by asking the judge to dismiss the entire case based on lack of evidence.
They get up and they say, it's our belief the prosecution has not proven its case.
Generally, it's a pro forma request, a routine part of every defense open.
It's said at every trial. It usually takes about 1 minute to be asked for and rejected by the judge.
But this time, the judge didn't reject the request, at least not outright.
The judge considered it, and the judge said he needed to think about it.
The judge said he would rule on that later.
So, sensing that the prosecution's case was weak, the defense wasted no time going on the attack, pointing out that the affair that had supposedly been part of Pamela's motive had been over for nearly a year when the murder occurred.
She was not engaged in any affairs when the act was committed, so there was nobody she was trying to leave her husband for.
And the family's claim that Ricky had caught Pamela stealing from the couple's landscaping company. The defense called an accountant who had reviewed the books, who testified that he'd found no evidence to back up that claim.
She had not taken any money from the business. There were no financial irregularities.
And the insurance money Pamela stood to gain from Ricky's death. The defense called the Ballin's insurance agent to the stand, who testified that increasing Ricky's coverage had been the agent's idea.
The insurance agent was all too happy to come in and said the insurance policy was increased at my insistence.
And the reason why was because they would actually be able to get a better premium for more coverage. So it wasn't as if she was the one who wanted to increase it just to murder her husband and collect on the proceeds.
By the time the defense finished its presentation, Pamela and her attorneys were confident they had all but destroyed the prosecution's case.
Pamela was optimistic. We were optimistic.
My feeling was that they have nothing. My sister is going to go home.
In fact, the prosecution's circumstantial case was looking so weak that almost everyone in the courtroom was expecting an acquittal.
It's a thin case.
But when the verdict was read on June 18th,
the jury found Pamela guilty on all counts.
Considering the lack of physical evidence tying her to the murder, Pamela and her supporters were blindsided by the verdict.
We were really flabbergasted that the jury came back with this guilty verdict.
They couldn't have been in the same room. They couldn't have heard the same things that I heard and came back with a guilty verdict.
I was utterly shocked.
Even more stunning was what the conviction meant for Pamela.
There's only one sentence you get on a murder conviction, that's life.
But before the judge officially handed down the sentence, he stunned the courtroom a second time by reminding the jury that he still hadn't ruled on the defense's request to throw out the case against Pamela.
Although the jury has come back with their verdict, he has not yet made his mind up.
And according to the judge, he did still have some serious reservations about the prosecution's case.
He felt that there was not enough evidence to convict her.
But he also said that he needed to review the case before making his ruling.
He wanted a month to think about it.
And then, after setting July 17th as the date for his decision, he announced that she would remain free on bail until he made it.
He said, "Miss Ballin, I am going to allow you to go home with your family."
By July 17, 2014, it had been a month since a DeKalb County, Georgia jury had convicted Pamela Ballin of murdering her husband, Ricky.
Not only was Mrs. Ballin shocked, but her attorneys were shocked, our entire office, her family was shocked.
But just as Pamela gave up hope, the judge had announced that he'd yet to make a decision on the defense's motion to dismiss the case for lack of evidence.
If he granted our motion, the trial would be over, regardless of what the jury found.
Equally shocking, despite the fact that she'd just been found guilty of murder, the 53-year-old wouldn't await that decision in a jail cell.
She's allowed to stay out on bond.
Ricky's family had been outraged by the judge's decision.
You've got 12 people sitting there. 12 people saw her guilty.
I feel like he was just killed all over again. That's how I felt, because we didn't get justice.
You expect to see the person handcuffed and taken to prison after they're found guilty.
Ricky's family hadn't been the only one upset either. Once it was reported in the media, the judge's decision caused controversy across Metro Atlanta.
She was a convicted murderer walking the streets.
There was a public outcry.
In fact, there had been such an outcry that just 5 days after her release, the DA demanded that Pamela be re-arrested. And on June 26, 2014, Pamela had turned herself in to the DeKalb County Police.
Pamela had no interest in running from the law.
And once back in court on the morning of July 17th, Pamela and her attorneys appeared confident that she would be going home again.
Keith Adams felt reasonably confident they might get some type of ruling in their favor.
But when the judge finally made his announcement,
he denied our motion for mistrial.
Instead, he had decided to respect the jury's decision.
He indicated that he had never seen a case that was as poorly investigated. He was loath to as he put it, take it out of the hands of the jury.
The sudden reversal was almost too much for Pamela to comprehend.
She was numb. She was in shock.
I don't think she came into that courtroom thinking that she would be going to prison.
But that was precisely where she was going.
State law carries a mandatory life sentence for murder here in Georgia.
According to Ricky's son, David, who had agreed with the jury's verdict, his father's family had mixed feelings about the outcome.
There was simultaneously a sense of release and a sense of shock. We've been waiting for this so long, but in reality, we also expected it not to ever come.
Although if Pamela, her family, and her defense team have their way, the fight is far from over.
Immediately upon her being sentenced, we filed a motion for new trial. We will be back in court trying this case again.
Given an opportunity, we will show them that she is very much innocent.
It was just after 8 o'clock on the evening of March 19th, 2002, when the streets of Bologna settled into the familiar rhythm of another ordinary weekday. The rush of commuters was fading. Cafes still glowed warmly behind fogged windows. Conversations drifted through narrow medieval streets, and bicycles rolled quietly across centuries-old cobblestones. There was nothing about that evening that suggested Italy was only moments away from witnessing one of the most consequential political assassinations of the early 21st century. For most residents, it was simply another night. For one man, it would be his last. Marco Biaggi had made the same journey countless times before. After finishing another day of work in Medina, he boarded a train back to Bologna, following a routine that had become almost mechanical through years of dedication to his profession. A respected professor of labor law and an advisor to the Italian Ministry of Labor, Biaggi lived a life defined by lectures, research, meetings, and long hours devoted to public policy. His work had earned him recognition throughout Italy, but it had also placed him at the center of a national debate that was growing more hostile with every passing month. Yet as the train arrived that evening, nothing about his actions suggested he expected danger to be waiting. He collected his familiar bicycle, mounted it, and began the short ride through the city toward his home on Via Valdonica. The route was ordinary. The destination was ordinary. The evening itself appeared ordinary. Before reaching his house, Marco Biaggi made one final telephone call. He spoke briefly with his wife, letting her know that he was almost home. It was a simple gesture that countless families repeat every day without giving a second thought. There was no indication that this conversation would become the final exchange between husband and wife. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no ominous warnings, no final declarations. Just the reassuring certainty that he would be home within moments. He never crossed the threshold. At approximately 8:15 p.m., Biaggi turned onto Via Valdonica and approached the entrance to his residence. He slowed his bicycle, preparing to stop in front of the door as he had done so many evenings before. Within seconds, the routine ended. At least two men, who had already positioned themselves nearby, emerged from their hiding place. They offered no warning. There was no confrontation, no attempt at conversation, no demand for money or valuables. Instead, they raised their firearms and fired multiple shots from close range. The attack unfolded with chilling efficiency. Several bullets struck Marco Biaggi in the chest and back. The force of the gunfire sent him collapsing beside his bicycle before he had any opportunity to react or seek cover. The bicycle that had carried him safely home hundreds of times now lay overturned beside him, becoming one of the defining images of the crime scene. The gunmen did not linger. Their objective had never been robbery or intimidation. Moments after opening fire, they fled the scene aboard a motorcycle, disappearing into the streets of Bologna before emergency responders could arrive. The entire attack lasted only a matter of seconds. It was swift, carefully executed, and devastatingly effective. When investigators reached the scene, the evidence immediately challenged any assumption that this had been an ordinary homicide. Marco Biaggi's wallet remained untouched. His identification was still with him. Personal belongings had not been disturbed. Nothing had been stolen. Nearby, investigators recovered multiple 9mm shell casings scattered across the pavement. The location of the shooting, directly outside the entrance to his home, and the precision with which the assailants had chosen their moment suggested planning rather than impulse. Whoever had carried out the assassination had known exactly when Biaggi would arrive. They knew he would be alone. They knew there would be no security officers accompanying him. They knew precisely how long they would have before disappearing into the night. Those facts transformed what first appeared to be a tragic killing into something much larger. This was not random violence. It was not a personal dispute. It was not a failed robbery. It was a targeted assassination. Within hours, that conclusion became impossible to ignore. Responsibility for the killing was claimed by Neuve Brigade Ross, Partido Comunista Combatant, the New Red Brigades, a far-left extremist organization that declared Marco Biaggi a legitimate target because of his role in advising the Italian government on labor reforms. In their statement, they portrayed him as an architect of policies they believed exploited workers and served what they described as the bourgeois state. Their words removed any doubt about motive. The murder was ideological. The victim had not been selected because of who he was in his private life, but because of what he represented in the eyes of political extremists. The assassination sent shockwaves throughout Italy. For decades, the country had endured periods marked by political violence, terrorism, and ideological conflict. Yet many believe that era had largely faded into history. The killing of Marco Biaggi suggested otherwise. It raised unsettling questions about whether old extremist movements had regained strength beneath the surface of modern Italian society. Newspapers across the nation carried images of the crime scene. Television broadcasts replayed reports from Via Valdonica. Public officials condemned the attack as an assault not merely on one individual, but on democratic institutions themselves. As investigators began reconstructing Biaggi's final movements, another troubling fact emerged. He had previously received repeated death threats. Because of those threats, authorities had once assigned him police protection, yet only months before his death. That protection had been withdrawn after officials concluded that the immediate danger had diminished. The decision would become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of the entire case. Critics questioned whether the assassination might have been prevented had the security detail remained in place. Supporters of the decision argued that risk assessments had been made according to the information available at the time. Regardless of where responsibility ultimately lay, one reality could not be changed. On the evening of March 19, 2002, Marco Biaggi returned home alone. Waiting for him were men who had already decided that he would never enter his house again. His death was more than the loss of a respected scholar. It became the symbol of an enduring conflict between democratic policymaking and violent political extremism. The image of a fallen bicycle beside the doorway of his home would come to represent not only the final moments of one man's life, but also a painful reminder that ideas, when twisted into ideological absolutism, can transform ordinary streets into scenes of calculated murder. Before understanding how investigators eventually unraveled the conspiracy, before examining the organization that claimed responsibility, and before following the courtroom proceedings that brought several perpetrators to justice, it is necessary to understand the man whose life ended on that quiet March evening. Who was Marco Biaggi? How did a professor devoted to labor law become the target of an organized terrorist assassination? And how did a career dedicated to public policy place him at the center of one of Italy's most Significant political crimes of the modern era? Those questions begin long before the gunshots echoed through Via Valdanica. They begin with the life of the man himself. Marco Biagi was born on November 24, 1950, and built a career that would earn him recognition as one of Italy's most respected scholars in the field of labor law. Unlike many public figures whose names become known through political campaigns or media appearances, Biagi established his reputation through academia, research, and public service. His professional life revolved around understanding one of the most complex relationships within modern society: the balance between employers, employees, and a legal framework that governs work. He taught labor law at the University of Modena and at other Italian universities, where generations of students came to know him not as a politician, but as a professor whose work focused on the legal structures that shape everyday employment. His classroom represented a place of legal analysis rather than political activism, and his career reflected years of careful study devoted to understanding how labor markets function within a democratic society. Beyond the university, Marco Biagi also served as an advisor to the Italian Ministry of Labor during the government of Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. In that capacity, he participated in discussions surrounding labor market reform, an area of public policy that often generates intense debate because it directly affects employers, workers, businesses, and the broader economy. The proposals with which Biagi became associated sought to introduce greater flexibility into Italy's labor market, particularly regarding recruitment practices, employment contracts, and hiring arrangements. To supporters, these reforms represented an effort to modernize labor regulations and adapt Italy's economy to changing conditions. To critics, however, they raised serious concerns about the future protection of workers' rights. It is important to understand that Marco Biagi himself became increasingly identified with these reforms, not because he was an elected politician, but because of his role as an expert whose legal knowledge informed government policy. His academic expertise placed him at the intersection of law and politics, where technical legal proposals could quickly become symbols within broader ideological conflicts. As public discussion surrounding labor reform intensified, so too did the level of polarization across parts of Italian society. The government's proposals received support from those who believed greater labor flexibility would improve employment opportunities and economic competitiveness. At the same time, the reforms faced determined opposition from left-wing extremist groups and from sections of the labor movement that feared the proposed changes would weaken long-established protections for workers. These disagreements unfolded against a backdrop of passionate public debate. What had begun as legal and economic discussions increasingly acquired political significance. Within this climate, Marco Biagi gradually ceased to be viewed solely as an academic specialist. Instead, in the eyes of his fiercest opponents, he became a visible representative of policies they fundamentally rejected. Such transformations are not uncommon during periods of political tension. Individuals whose work is primarily technical can become symbolic figures once their expertise becomes associated with controversial government initiatives. In Biagi's case, his name became linked to labor reform itself, while supporters recognized him for his knowledge and contributions to legal scholarship. Extremist groups viewed him through an entirely different lens. Rather than seeing a university professor engaged in public service, they saw someone they believed embodied policies they opposed. This distinction would prove tragically significant. Beginning around 2001, Marco Biagi started receiving anonymous threats. These were not isolated incidents or vague expressions of disagreement. He received repeated death threats, warning him that his work had made him a target. The growing seriousness of these threats prompted Italian authorities to provide him with police protection. The decision reflected official recognition that the danger was considered credible enough to justifies security measures. For a professor whose professional life had been dedicated to research, teaching, and advising on legal policy, the presence of security personnel represented a profound change in daily life. Activities as ordinary as traveling between cities or returning home now required additional precautions. Yet despite the threats, Biaggi continued carrying out his professional responsibilities. He remained active as both an academic and a government advisor, continuing the work that had placed him at the center of national debate. The existence of police protection demonstrated that authorities understood the risks posed by extremist violence, particularly given Italy's historical experience with politically motivated terrorism. However, security arrangements are continually reassessed according to available intelligence and perceived levels of risk. After a period during which Marco Biaggi received protection, authorities concluded that the immediate threat had diminished. As a result, only a few months before his assassination, the decision was made to withdraw his police escort. At the time, this judgment reflected the assessment that the level of danger had decreased sufficiently to no longer require continuous protection. Such decisions are always based upon the information available when they are made, balancing limited security resources with evolving threat evaluations. Nevertheless, what appeared reasonable before March 19, 2002, would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Following Biaggi's assassination, public attention quickly turned toward the withdrawal of his protection. Many questioned whether the murder might have been prevented had security officers remained with him. Critics argued that the continued existence of death threats should have justified maintaining police protection. Others emphasized that risk assessments are inherently difficult and can only rely on intelligence, known at the time rather than hindsight. Regardless of differing perspectives, the debate became inseparable from the tragedy itself. The image of Marco Biaggi returning home alone on the evening of his death acquired even greater emotional weight once it became widely understood that he had previously been accompanied by bodyguards. The controversy extended beyond questions of individual responsibility. It raised broader concerns about how democratic societies protect public servants, scholars, and policy advisors who become targets of ideological violence. Could experts participating in public debate safely contribute their knowledge if extremist organizations sought to silence them through assassination? Could security services accurately predict when threats remained active and when they had diminished? These difficult questions would continue to resonate long after the investigation concluded. Looking back at Marco Biaggi's life before the attack, one detail becomes especially striking. Nothing within his career suggested involvement in violent conflict. He was neither a military officer nor a police commander. He was not a political party leader or an elected official. His profession was law. His work centered on studying employment regulations, advising institutions, and teaching students. Yet in an atmosphere of increasing ideological extremism, those activities proved sufficient for certain individuals to regard him as an enemy. The transformation of an academic into a terrorist target illustrates how political violence often extends beyond traditional political actors. Extremist organizations do not necessarily distinguish between policymakers and those who contribute expert advice to policymaking. In their worldview, anyone associated with ideas they reject may become a symbolic objective. That reality would ultimately shape every aspect of the events that followed. By early 2002, Marco Biaggi continued his daily routine despite the controversy surrounding his work. He regularly traveled between Medina and Bologna, balancing academic responsibilities with his advisory role to the Ministry of Labor. His schedule remained predictable, reflecting the disciplined rhythm of a university professor committed to both teaching and public service. Unfortunately, that same predictability also made it possible for others to observe his movements. The attackers who would later ambush him selected neither a random place nor a random time. Their success depended upon knowing his routine, understanding his travel habits, and recognizing that he no longer had police protection accompanying him. As Italy would soon discover, the ordinary routine that had defined Marco Biaggi's professional life had quietly become the foundation upon which a carefully planned political assassination would be carried out. March 19, 2002, began like countless other working days in the life of Marco Biaggi. There was nothing in the publicly known record to suggest that the day unfolded differently from his usual routine. As both a professor of labor law and an advisor to the Italian Ministry of Labor, his professional responsibilities regularly required him to travel between cities, balancing academic commitments with his advisory work. That routine had become a familiar rhythm, repeated week after week with the confidence that accompanies ordinary life. It was precisely that predictability, however, that would later reveal itself as one of the most important elements in understanding how the assassination was carried out. The events of that Tuesday did not immediately signal danger. There were no reported confrontations, no unusual incidents during the day, and no indication that the evening would become one of the darkest moments in modern Italian political history. As his work concluded, Marco Biaggi prepared for the journey home, following the same pattern that had become second nature. He traveled from Modena back toward Bologna, where his family awaited his return. For most commuters sharing the railway that evening, it was simply another trip home after work. Nobody could have known that one passenger had unknowingly become the target of a carefully prepared operation. When Biaggi arrived at Bologna railway station, he retrieved the bicycle he routinely used to complete the final portion of his journey. The bicycle was more than a means of transportation. It represented the simplicity of an everyday habit. Countless residents of Bologna relied upon bicycles to navigate the city's narrow historic streets, and Marco Biaggi was no different. Mounting the bicycle, he began riding through familiar roads that he had traveled innumerable times before. Every turn, every intersection, and every building along the route belonged to a landscape he knew well. Nothing appeared unusual. There were no obvious signs that anyone was following him. The streets reflected the ordinary atmosphere of an Italian evening. Shops remained open. Restaurants welcomed customers. Residents continued their routines without realizing that a meticulously planned assassination was already entering its final stage. As Marco Biaggi cycled toward Via Valdonica, he remained unaware that others had likely been monitoring his movements. The later findings of investigators would strongly suggest that the attackers possessed detailed knowledge of his schedule. They understood not only where he would arrive, but also when. Their ability to strike with remarkable precision indicated that his daily routine had been observed over an extended period. Such planning distinguished the attack from spontaneous violence. This was not an encounter driven by opportunity or impulse. Instead, it reflected patience, surveillance, and preparation. Before reaching his home, Marco Biaggi made what would become his final telephone call. He contacted his wife to let her know that he was almost home. The conversation was brief. According to the known facts, he simply informed her that he would soon arrive. There is no evidence of alarm or concern during that call. It was an ordinary communication between family members at the end of an ordinary workday, yet with the knowledge of what followed only moments later. The simplicity of that final conversation has acquired profound emotional significance. It became the last time his voice would be heard by those closest to him. There were no dramatic final words preserved for history, only the familiar reassurance that he was nearly home. As the evening progressed toward approximately 8:15 p.m., Marco Biaggi entered Via Valdonica. Home was only moments away. He slowed his bicycle as he approached the entrance to his residence. preparing to dismount and unlock the door. The sequence of events that followed unfolded with astonishing speed. At least 2 attackers, who had already positioned themselves nearby, moved into action. Their appearance was sudden, leaving Biaggi virtually no opportunity to react. There was no verbal confrontation. No demands were made. No attempt was made to threaten or intimidate him. The purpose of the ambush was clear from the very first moment. The attackers drew their firearms and immediately opened fire from close range. Multiple shots echoed through the street. The bullets struck Marco Biaggi in the chest and back. The close distance between the gunmen and their target ensured devastating accuracy. Within seconds, the professor collapsed beside his bicycle, mortally wounded before he could seek shelter or escape. The attack demonstrated a level of precision that investigators would later identify as consistent. With careful planning, every movement appeared calculated. The attackers had chosen the exact location where Biaggi would be most vulnerable, immediately outside his own home. At the moment when his attention was focused on stopping his bicycle and preparing to enter the building. They also selected a time when he was alone. Most significantly, they struck after his police protection had already been withdrawn months earlier. The combination of these factors strongly suggested that the perpetrators had invested considerable effort into studying his routine. Their knowledge extended beyond his daily schedule to include his security situation. The attack itself lasted only a matter of seconds. Having fired multiple rounds, the gunmen wasted no time. They immediately fled the scene aboard a motorcycle before police or emergency responders could arrive. Their escape was as rapid as the assault itself. Witnesses had little opportunity to react before the assassins disappeared into the streets of Bologna. By the time help reached via Valdanica, the attackers were gone. What remained was the devastating aftermath. Marco Biaggi lay at the entrance of his home, beside the bicycle that had carried him on what he believed would be another routine journey home. Investigators arriving at the scene immediately began documenting every available piece of physical evidence. Among the most significant discoveries were multiple 9mm shell casings scattered near the location where Biaggi had fallen. The recovered casings confirmed that several shots had been fired during the attack, consistent with witness accounts of rapid gunfire. Equally important was what investigators did not find. There were no signs of robbery. Marco Biaggi's wallet remained with him. His identification documents and personal belongings had not been disturbed. Nothing suggested that the motive involved financial gain. This absence of theft quickly narrowed the possible explanations for the crime. The attackers had ignored every valuable possession their victim carried. Their sole objective had been to kill him. Another powerful image emerged from the crime scene and would become one of the enduring symbols of the assassination. Marco Biaggi's bicycle lay overturned beside his body. The scene captured the abrupt transition from ordinary daily life to extraordinary violence. Only moments earlier, the bicycle had represented the final stage of a familiar commute home. Now it rested motionless beside a man whose routine had been permanently interrupted. Photographs of the location reinforced the realization that the assassination occurred not in a distant or isolated place, but directly outside the victim's own residence. The symbolism of the fallen bicycle resonated deeply throughout Italy because it illustrated how political violence had invaded one of the most personal spaces imaginable, the threshold of a person's home. As investigators evaluated the evidence, several conclusions emerged almost immediately. The timing of the ambush, the choice of location, the speed of execution, and the absence of theft all pointed toward a targeted killing rather than an ordinary homicide. The attackers had not encountered Marco Biaggi by chance. They had waited specifically for him. Their decision to strike immediately after his arrival demonstrated detailed knowledge of his movements. Furthermore, The attack took place at a moment when Biaggi no longer benefited from police protection, a fact that would later become central to public debate. Although the full scope of the conspiracy had not yet been uncovered, investigators already recognized that they were confronting a crime far more complex than a conventional murder investigation. Their initial suspicions were reinforced only hours later when responsibility for the assassination was claimed by Neuve Brigade Ross, Partido Comunista Combatant, the New Red Brigades. In its statement, the organization described Marco Biaggi as an architect of labor exploitation and a servant of what it called the bourgeois state. These declarations left little doubt regarding motive. The murder had been carried out not because of any personal grievance, but because extremist ideology had transformed a respected legal scholar into what the organization considered a legitimate target. For Italy, the significance of the assassination extended far beyond the tragic death of one individual. The attack revived painful memories of earlier periods marked by political terrorism, reminding the nation that ideological violence had not entirely disappeared. The streets of Bologna, which only moments before had reflected the calm routine of everyday life, had become the setting for a carefully orchestrated act of political assassination. Yet while the perpetrators had succeeded in carrying out their deadly mission, their escape did not mark the end of the story. Instead, it marked the beginning of an extensive counterterrorism investigation that would eventually trace the conspiracy back through hidden networks, safe houses, communications, and members of the New Red Brigades. The gunmen had vanished into the night, but the evidence they left behind and the organization that openly claimed responsibility ensured that the search for those responsible had only just begun. The assassination of Marco Biaggi transformed almost instantly from a local homicide investigation into one of Italy's highest priority counterterrorism operations. Within hours of the shooting on Via Valdonica, investigators understood they were confronting far more than a conventional murder. The location of the attack, the precision with which it had been executed, the complete absence of any attempt to rob the victim, and the political significance of Marco Biaggi himself all pointed toward a carefully organized operation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Every minute after the gunfire ceased became critical. Detectives, forensic specialists, anti-terror investigators, and intelligence officials moved quickly to preserve the crime scene and begin reconstructing the final moments of Biaggi's life. Their challenge was immense. The attackers had completed the assassination in only a matter of seconds before disappearing on a motorcycle into the streets of Bologna, leaving behind little more than physical evidence and countless unanswered questions. The first stage of the investigation focused on the scene itself. Forensic teams carefully documented every visible detail. The position of Marco Biaggi's body, the location of his bicycle, and the distribution of the recovered 9mm shell casings all became pieces of a larger puzzle. Investigators examined the entrance to the residence, measuring distances and determining the probable positions occupied by both the victim and the attackers during the ambush. The evidence confirmed what witnesses had already suggested. The shooting had occurred at extremely close range. This was not an exchange of gunfire or a confrontation that escalated unexpectedly. It was a deliberate execution. The attackers had approached with one purpose and one purpose alone. Equally revealing was what investigators failed to discover. Marco Biaggi's wallet remained in place. His identification documents were still with him. His personal belongings had not been disturbed. Nothing suggested an attempted theft. The absence of robbery immediately narrowed the range of possible motives. Detectives could confidently exclude financial gain as the primary objective. Instead, every available indication pointed toward a targeted assassination. The attackers had ignored everything of material value because the only objective had been to ensure Marco Biaggi did not survive. As investigators reconstructed the chronology of the evening, another important conclusion emerged. The gunman had selected the exact moment when Biaggi reached his home, indicating that they possessed detailed knowledge of his routine. Such precision could not easily be explained by chance. Marco Biaggi regularly traveled between Medina and Bologna as part of his professional responsibilities. But arriving at the entrance of his home at precisely the right moment required advanced preparation. Investigators, therefore, concluded that the perpetrators had almost certainly observed his movements. Over an extended period, they knew where he lived. They knew how he traveled. They knew approximately when he would arrive. Perhaps most significantly, they also knew that he no longer had police protection accompanying him. That realization immediately influenced the direction of the investigation. Rather than searching only for the individuals who had fired the shots, investigators also began considering the broader network necessary to support such an operation. Someone had likely monitored Marco Biaggi's schedule. Someone may have gathered information regarding his daily movements. Others may have assisted in planning escape routes, securing transportation, or providing logistical support. Counterterrorism investigations differ fundamentally from ordinary homicide cases because they rarely involve isolated offenders. Organized extremist groups typically rely upon multiple participants performing specialized roles before, during, and after an attack. Consequently, Italian anti-terror authorities expanded their inquiry well beyond the immediate crime scene. Only hours after the assassination, their suspicions received dramatic confirmation. Neuve Brigade Ross, Partito Comunista combatant, publicly claimed responsibility for the murder. The declaration fundamentally altered the investigation. Detectives no longer needed to speculate whether the killing had political motives. The organization itself openly announced that Marco Biaggi had been deliberately selected because of his work advising the government on labor reforms. In its statement, the group characterized him as the architect of labor exploitation and a servant of the bourgeois state. Those descriptions reflected the organization's ideological worldview rather than objective reality, but they provided investigators with a direct explanation of motive. The murder had not been committed because of any private dispute involving Marco Biaggi. It had been carried out because extremists viewed his professional role as symbolically significant. Although the public claim of responsibility established motive, it did not immediately identify every individual responsible for carrying out the attack. The investigation, therefore, entered a much broader phase. Italian anti-terror police launched an extensive nationwide operation aimed at dismantling the organization behind the assassination. Investigators began reviewing thousands of telephone records in an effort to identify communication patterns among suspected members and associates. Every relevant call became a potential lead. Analysts searched for repeated contacts, unusual activity, and connections that might reveal hidden relationships within the organization. This painstaking process required enormous patience. Unlike dramatic portrayals often seen in fictional crime stories, real counterterrorism investigations depend upon meticulous analysis of vast amounts of information, where seemingly insignificant details may eventually reveal critical connections. At the same time, authorities searched safe houses believed to have been used by members of the New Red Brigades. Such locations often serve multiple purposes within clandestine organizations, functioning as meeting places, storage sites, or operational bases where plans can be developed away from public attention. Investigators also searched weapons caches associated with the extremist network, seeking firearms, ammunition, documents, and any physical evidence capable of linking specific individuals to the assassination. Every recovered item underwent detailed examination. Even seemingly routine objects could provide valuable information about the structure and activities of the organization. Beyond physical evidence, Investigators devoted significant resources to identifying the broader support network surrounding Neuve Brigade Ross. Terrorist organizations rarely function solely through the actions of those who directly commit violent acts. Successful operations frequently depend upon individuals responsible for surveillance, transportation, communication, logistics, and other forms of assistance. As a result, investigators attempted to map relationships among suspected members, supporters, and collaborators. Their objective extended beyond identifying the gunman who fired the fatal shots. They sought to dismantle the organization capable of planning and executing political violence. Despite the scale of the investigation, immediate arrests did not follow. Counterterrorism cases often develop gradually as evidence accumulates through careful intelligence work rather than rapid breakthroughs. Months passed while investigators continued gathering information, following leads, and expanding their understanding of the organization's internal structure. The turning point arrived the following year. In 2003, Italian authorities encountered two leading members of the New Red Brigades aboard a train. What began as a police operation quickly escalated into a violent confrontation. During the exchange of gunfire, Mario Gillespie was killed. Nadia Desdemona Elias survived the confrontation and was arrested alive. The significance of this encounter extended far beyond the immediate arrests. For investigators, capturing a senior member of the organization represented an opportunity to obtain evidence that had previously remained inaccessible. Following the operation, authorities recovered documents, computers, and additional organizational materials connected to the extremist network. These materials proved invaluable to the investigation. Modern terrorist organizations rely heavily upon documentation, communication, and internal records to coordinate their activities. By examining the seized computers and documents, investigators gained deeper insight into the structure, operations, and planning methods of Neuve Brigade Ross. The recovered evidence helped authorities identify relationships among members, reconstruct organizational activities, and strengthen existing investigative findings. Rather than relying solely upon witness testimony or forensic evidence from the crime scene, prosecutors could now combine physical evidence with documentary material originating from within the organization itself. This convergence of evidence dramatically strengthened the case. Perhaps most importantly, the information obtained after the 2003 operation enabled Italian authorities to dismantle much of the New Red Brigade's operational network. Counterterrorism investigations aim not only to solve individual crimes, but also to prevent future attacks. By disrupting the organization's infrastructure, authorities reduced its ability to continue conducting politically motivated violence. The assassination of Marco Biagi had demonstrated that the group retained both capability and determination. The subsequent investigation sought to ensure that capability could no longer be exercised. Throughout the investigation, one characteristic remained consistently apparent. The murder had required careful planning rather than spontaneous decision-making. The attackers selected a precise location. They struck at a predictable moment in Marco Biagi's routine. They exploited knowledge that he no longer traveled with police protection. They escaped quickly using a prepared motorcycle. Each of these elements reflected organization rather than improvisation. Investigators therefore viewed every newly discovered document, communication, and organizational connection through the lens of planning. Their objective was not simply to identify who pulled the trigger, but to understand every stage of preparation leading to the assassination itself. By the time prosecutors completed their work, the investigation had evolved from examining a single crime scene into exposing an organized extremist network responsible for one of Italy's most significant political murders of the modern era. The evidence collected from Via Valdonica, the extensive review of communications, the searches of safe houses and weapons caches, the recovery of organizational documents, and the arrests following the 2003 train confrontation combined to produce a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy. The investigation had required persistence, coordination among multiple branches of law enforcement, and months of painstaking analysis. Yet its ultimate success ensured that the case would proceed beyond unanswered questions and toward judicial accountability. The responsibility for determining guilt would now shift from investigators to the courtroom, where the evidence assembled over years of counterterrorism work would be presented before judges tasked with delivering justice for the murder of Marco Biagi. By the time the case of Marco Biagi reached the courtroom, the investigation had already evolved far beyond the initial crime scene on Via Valdonica. What began as the immediate response to a targeted shooting had gradually expanded into a comprehensive counterterrorism case. Built upon months of surveillance analysis, recovered documents, intercepted communications, and the dismantling of operational structures linked to Neuve Brigade Ross, Partido Comunista Combatant. The transition from investigation to trial marked a critical shift. The focus was no longer on reconstructing how the assassination happened, but on legally establishing responsibility for those involved in planning, supporting, and executing it. In 2005, proceedings formally unfolded before the Court of Bologna, where prosecutors presented a case built on the accumulated findings of the anti-terror investigation. The courtroom became the space where fragmented elements of evidence, telephone records, organizational materials, forensic findings, and intelligence gathered from arrests were assembled into a coherent narrative of conspiracy and politically motivated violence. The defendants brought before the court represented different levels of involvement within the extremist network rather than a single unified role. Among them were Nadia Desdemona Elias, Roberto Morandi, Marco Mezzasalma, Diana Blafari Malazzi, and Simone Boccaccini. Each individual was accused of participating in the broader operational structure of the organization responsible for the assassination of Marco Biagi, though their alleged roles varied significantly. Some were charged with direct participation in the planning and execution of the attack, while others were accused of logistical support, surveillance activities, communication roles, or facilitating the operational capacity of the group. The prosecution's central argument did not rely solely on the act of the shooting itself, which had already been established through earlier investigative findings, but rather on demonstrating that the murder was the product of an organized and ideologically driven network. According to the prosecution, the assassination was not an isolated action carried out by a single perpetrator, but the culmination of a structured operation conducted by an extremist organization that had identified Biagi as a symbolic target due to his role in labor law reform and his advisory position within the Ministry of Labor. The ideological framing of the crime was a key element throughout the trial. Prosecutors emphasized that the attack had been preceded by surveillance, planning, and coordination consistent with the operational behavior of Neuve Brigade Ross. The earlier claim of responsibility issued by the organization played a significant role in establishing motive, linking the defendants to a group that explicitly justified the assassination in political terms. The statement in which Biagi was described as an architect of labor exploitation and as servant of the bourgeois state was introduced as evidence of intent, illustrating how the organization itself framed the killing as part of a broader ideological struggle. Within the courtroom, the proceedings extended beyond the immediate facts of the assassination to encompass the broader structure and activities of the extremist network. Prosecutors sought to demonstrate how individuals within the organization contributed to its operational continuity, whether through direct action or through supporting roles that enabled surveillance, communication, and logistical coordination. The complexity of the case reflected the nature of counterterrorism prosecutions, where responsibility is often distributed across multiple participants rather than concentrated in a single actor. As evidence was presented, the court examined the materials recovered during the investigation, including documents and digital records seized following the 2003 confrontation in which Mario Gillespie was killed and Nadia Desdemona Elias was arrested. These materials had provided insight into the internal functioning of the organization, strengthening the prosecution's argument that the assassination of Marco Biagi was not an isolated event, but part of a deliberate operational strategy. The defense, as is typical in such cases, challenged aspects of the prosecution's interpretation of involvement and responsibility, particularly regarding the extent to which individual defendants could be directly linked to the specific act of the killing. However, the weight of accumulated evidence, combined with the organizational structure revealed through the investigation, formed the foundation upon which the court would base its judgment. The complexity of assigning individual responsibility within a collective extremist network became one of the central legal challenges of the proceedings, as the court had to distinguish between direct participation in the assassination and broader involvement in the organization responsible for orchestrating it. In its final judgment, delivered in 2005, the Court of Bologna issued multiple convictions, imposing life sentences on several of the principal defendants. Among those receiving life imprisonment was Nadia Desdemona Elias, identified as one of the central figures within the organization and already known for her role in armed confrontation during the 2003 train incident. Other defendants, including Roberto Morandi, Marco Mezzasalma, and Diana Blafari Malazzi, were also sentenced to life imprisonment based on their involvement in the planning and operational structure associated with the assassination. Simone Boccaccini was likewise convicted. However, his sentence was later subject to reduction during the appeals process, reflecting judicial reconsideration of the extent of his involvement relative to other members of the organization. The verdicts collectively affirmed the existence of a coordinated extremist network responsible for the assassination of Marco Biagi and confirmed the legal accountability of its members across different levels of participation. The court's findings underscored the conclusion that the murder had been the result of deliberate planning carried out by an organized group rather than an isolated act of violence. The legal outcome represented the culmination of years of investigative work that had begun in the immediate aftermath of the shooting and expanded into one of Italy's most significant counterterrorism prosecutions of the early 21st century. While the courtroom focused on legal responsibility rather than emotional interpretation, the weight of the proceedings was unavoidable. The evidence presented had traced the path from ideological statements issued by the organization, through surveillance and planning, to the execution of a targeted assassination outside the victim's home. The conviction of multiple defendants confirmed that the attack had not been spontaneous, but the result of a structured operation carried out by individuals acting within an extremist framework. By the conclusion of the trial, the judicial system had established accountability for those directly and indirectly involved in the assassination, closing one of the most complex legal chapters arising from political violence in Italy during that period. The sentences handed down in Bologna reflected both the severity of the crime and the court's recognition of its broader implications for public security and democratic institutions. The case demonstrated how modern judicial systems address acts of terrorism not only by identifying perpetrators, but by dismantling the networks that enable such acts to occur. With a verdict delivered, attention would eventually shift beyond the courtroom toward the broader consequences of the assassination, including its political impact, the debate over security failures, and the enduring legacy of Marco Biagi's work, but within the legal framework itself. The 2005 ruling marked the point at which the judicial process formally accounted for the crime in its entirety, assigning responsibility across the network that had transformed ideological conviction into lethal action. In the aftermath of the assassination of Marco Biagi, Italy was confronted with more than the loss of a respected academic and government advisor. The killing on Via Valdonica in Bologna became a national shockwave that extended far beyond the boundaries of criminal investigation or courtroom proceedings. It forced the country to revisit uncomfortable questions about political extremism, institutional protection, and the fragile boundary between democratic debate and ideological violence. The image of Biaghi's bicycle lying overturned beside the entrance to his home quickly became one of the most enduring visual symbols of the case, representing not only the abrupt end of a life, but also the intrusion of organized violence into the most ordinary and personal spaces of everyday existence. One of the most immediate consequences of the assassination was the widespread public and political reaction across Italy. The fact that Marco Biagi had been a civilian expert rather than a political officeholder made the attack particularly unsettling. He was not a minister or a party leader. He was a scholar whose work had entered the political arena through policy advice and academic expertise. His killing demonstrated that individuals engaged in shaping public policy, even in technical or advisory roles, could become targets of ideological violence. This realization contributed to a broader sense of vulnerability among academics, policy advisors, and public intellectuals working in fields connected to government reform. A central and deeply controversial issue that emerged in the wake of the assassination concerned the withdrawal of police protection that had previously been assigned to Biagi. It was known that he had received death threats in the period leading up to his death, and at one point authorities had provided him with security measures. However, this protection had been discontinued months before the attack, following an assessment that the level of threat had decreased. After the murder, this decision became a subject of intense scrutiny and debate within Italian public discourse. Critics questioned whether the reassessment had underestimated the continuing risk posed to Biagi, arguing that the persistence of threats should have justified maintaining protective measures. Others emphasized the inherent difficulty in security decision-making, where authorities must evaluate risk based on available intelligence at a given moment, without the benefit of hindsight. This debate extended beyond the specifics of one individual case and raised broader concerns about how states assess and respond to threats against individuals involved in politically sensitive work. It highlighted the challenges faced by security institutions tasked with balancing limited resources against evolving and sometimes ambiguous risks. The discussion also underscored a painful reality. Even when threats are recognized, the decision of how and when to act upon them is never straightforward, and the consequences of those decisions can become tragically visible only after irreversible events occur. In response to the assassination, Italian authorities reinforced security measures for individuals involved in policy formulation and public administration, particularly those engaged in areas considered politically sensitive, such as labor reform. The killing of Marco Biagi served as a catalyst for reassessing how the state protects not only elected officials, but also experts whose work contributes directly to legislative and regulatory processes. This shift reflected an expanded understanding of risk in the context of political violence, where targets are not limited to traditional political figures, but may also include academics and advisors whose influence shapes public policy. Beyond immediate security responses, the assassination also left a lasting imprint on Italian legislative and institutional developments. The labor reform associated with Marco Biagi's advisory work later became widely known as the Biagi Law, a designation that reflected both its policy origins and its symbolic association with his legacy. In this sense, his name became permanently linked to the field of labor regulation in Italy, not only as an academic contributor, but as a figure whose work had a lasting institutional impact. The naming of the reform in his memory represented a form of recognition that extended beyond academic circles into the legal and political structure of the country itself. However, the legacy of the case cannot be understood solely through legislative outcomes or institutional reforms. It also remains a powerful example of how ideological extremism can transform abstract political disagreements into acts of lethal violence. The organization responsible for the assassination, Nuove Brigate Rosse, Partito Comunista Combattente, framed its actions in ideological terms, viewing individuals involved in state policy as legitimate targets. This worldview eliminated the distinction between political opposition and physical elimination, reducing complex policy debates to justifications for violence. The consequences of such thinking were made starkly visible in the death of Marco Biagi, whose professional role as a legal scholar became the basis for his selection as a target. In reflecting on the case, it is impossible to separate the personal tragedy from its broader historical significance. The assassination did not occur in isolation. It emerged within a context of ideological tension, historical memory of political violence in Italy, and ongoing debates over economic and labor reform. Yet even within that context, the killing represented a rupture, a moment in which theoretical conflict became irreversible action. The courtroom verdicts delivered in 2005 formally established legal responsibility for those involved, but they could not fully address the deeper societal questions raised by the crime. Among those questions is the enduring issue of how democratic societies protect individuals whose work places them at the intersection of policy and ideology. The case demonstrated that even highly specialized academic expertise can become politically charged when it influences government decision-making. It also highlighted the vulnerability of those who, despite not being politicians themselves, contribute directly to the shaping of political outcomes. Another lasting implication concerns the memory of institutional responsibility. The controversy surrounding the withdrawal of Biaghi's police protection remains part of the broader narrative of the case, serving as a reminder of the complexity inherent in security decision-making. It illustrates how judgments made under uncertainty can later be reinterpreted through the lens of tragic outcomes, raising difficult questions about accountability without offering simple answers. Ultimately, the murder of Marco Biagi stands as a reminder of the destructive potential of ideological absolutism. It shows how individuals engaged in public service, even in academic or advisory capacities, can become symbolic targets in conflicts that extend far beyond their personal actions or intentions. It also demonstrates the capacity of modern states to respond through investigation, prosecution, and institutional reform, even as they confront the limitations of prevention. The image of that quiet street in Bologna, the bicycle lying where its owner fell, and the sudden intrusion of violence into an ordinary evening continues to resonate not only as a historical event, but as a reflection on the fragile balance between knowledge, policy, and political extremism. In remembering the case, what remains most significant is not only the resolution achieved through the courts, but the enduring lesson about the cost of ideological violence and the importance of safeguarding those who contribute to public life through reasoned debate and intellectual work. This final segment functions as an extended epilogue to the case of Marco Biagi, revisiting the final outcome not through new events or developments, but through the lingering historical, social, and institutional weight that remained after the courtroom verdicts had been delivered. although the judicial process formally concluded in 2005 with convictions and life sentences for key members of Neuve Brigade Ross, Partido Comunista Combatant. The story of Marco Biagi did not end at the moment responsibility was assigned. Instead, what remained was the slower, quieter aftermath of a crime that had already reshaped political awareness, institutional security practices, and public memory in Italy. The assassination had occurred in a matter of seconds on a street in Bologna, but its consequences extended far beyond that single evening, embedding themselves into the way Italy understood the vulnerability of individuals working within the sphere of public policy. In the years following the trial, the memory of Marco Biagi became increasingly associated not only with the circumstances of his death, but also with the intellectual and institutional work he had contributed during his life. His role as a labor law scholar and government advisor ensured that his name remained present within discussions of labor market reform, particularly through the legislative framework that later became known as the Biagi Law. This designation reflected a formal recognition of his contributions, linking his academic and advisory work permanently to Italian labor legislation. Yet this connection also carried a deeper symbolic meaning. It represented an attempt by institutions to preserve the constructive dimension of his work in contrast to the violence that had ended his life. While the law itself functioned within the technical and legal structure of the Italian state, its name served as a reminder that public policy is shaped not only by political leaders, but also by scholars and experts whose work informs legislative change. At the same time, the assassination continued to resonate within broader discussions about political extremism in Italy. The reemergence of Neuve Brigade Ross in the early 2000s demonstrated that the legacy of past decades of ideological violence had not been fully erased. Although the organization was significantly weakened following arrests and the dismantling of its operational network, the case of Marco Biagi illustrated that remnants of extremist ideology could still translate into targeted violence under certain conditions. This realization prompted renewed attention within Italian security institutions toward monitoring extremist activity, particularly in relation to groups that sought to revive or reinterpret earlier ideological frameworks. The investigation and subsequent trial had already demonstrated that the assassination was not the result of isolated action, but rather the outcome of a structured network capable of surveillance, coordination, and execution. In a broader historical context, this reinforced the understanding that political violence rarely emerges spontaneously, but instead develops through organizational processes that combine ideology with operational capacity. One of the most enduring aspects of the case remained the public debate surrounding the withdrawal of police protection for Marco Biagi prior to his death. Even after legal proceedings concluded, this issue continued to be referenced in discussions about security policy and institutional responsibility. The fact that Biagi had previously received threats and had been assigned protection, only for that protection to be removed months before the assassination, became a focal point for questions about how risk is assessed and how decisions are made regarding the safety of individuals under potential threat. While official evaluations at the time had determined that the level of risk had decreased, the outcome of those assessments was later scrutinized through the irreversible consequences of the attack. This tension between procedural decision-making and retrospective interpretation highlights one of the most difficult aspects of security governance: the necessity of making judgments based on incomplete and evolving information. The assassination of Marco Biagi thus became not only a case study in counterterrorism response, but also a reference point in debates about the limits of predictive security analysis. Beyond institutional and political considerations, the case also left a lasting impression on public consciousness. The image of Biagi's bicycle lying beside him at the entrance of his home remained one of the most recognizable visual elements associated with the assassination. It captured in a single frame the abrupt transition from ordinary life to irreversible violence. There was nothing symbolic in the bicycle itself prior to the attack. It was simply part of his daily routine, a practical means of transportation used in a historic city where cycling was common. Yet in the aftermath, it became an unintended emblem of vulnerability, representing how even the most routine aspects of daily existence can become embedded within larger political narratives when violence intervenes. The emotional resonance of this image contributed to the broader public understanding of the case, reinforcing the sense that the assassination had occurred not in a distant or abstract context, but in a familiar urban environment that could belong to any ordinary day. In reflecting on the life and death of Marco Biagi, it becomes clear that the significance of the case lies in the intersection between individual biography and structural forces. Biagi himself was not a political leader engaged in public confrontation, but a legal scholar whose work influenced policy development through expertise rather than authority. His assassination demonstrated how individuals operating within technical or academic roles can become symbolically charged figures when their work intersects with contested areas of public policy. This transformation from academic to target was not a reflection of personal actions in isolation, but of the way extremist ideologies interpret and assign meaning to institutional roles. The consequences of this interpretation were fatal, turning policy expertise into a justification for violence in the worldview of the perpetrators. At the level of legal resolution, the convictions delivered by the Court of Bologna in 2005 provided formal closure to the criminal proceedings. The sentences imposed on members of Neuve Brigade Ross affirmed the responsibility of the organization and its affiliates in planning and executing the assassination. However, legal closure did not equate to historical or social closure. The case continued to be referenced in discussions of terrorism, institutional security, and political violence, particularly in relation to how modern states respond to threats against non-traditional targets, such as academics and advisors. Over time, the assassination of Marco Biagi became part of a broader narrative about the evolution of political extremism in Italy, illustrating both the persistence of ideological violence and the capacity of state institutions to respond through investigation, prosecution, and structural reform. Ultimately, the enduring lesson of the case is not confined to the events of March 19, 2002, nor to the courtroom verdicts that followed. It lies in the recognition that democratic societies rely not only on elected officials, but also on experts whose work supports the functioning of public policy, and that the protection of such individuals is an essential component of maintaining an open and functional political system. The death of Marco Biagi exposed the vulnerability inherent in this system when ideological extremism seeks to replace debate with violence. Yet the subsequent investigation, arrests, and convictions also demonstrated the capacity of institutions to respond, to reconstruct accountability, and to affirm the rule of law in the face of politically motivated crime. In the end, what remains is a story defined by contrast between ordinary life and sudden violence, between academic work and ideological targeting, and between the fragility of individual safety and the enduring effort of institutions to uphold justice in the aftermath of loss. Continuing the narrative beyond the original structure, this final extension serves as a reflective closing passage rather than an introduction of new events, focusing instead on the lasting resonance of the assassination of Marco Biagi and the way the case continues to exist in institutional memory, public discourse, and historical interpretation. Even years after the verdicts of 2005 formally concluded the judicial process, The story of Marco Biagi remains present in Italy not as an unresolved investigation, but as a completed case whose meaning continues to be examined through different lenses: legal, political, and social. The passage of time has not diminished the clarity of the core facts established in the investigation and trial. A targeted assassination was carried out on March 19, 2002, by members of an organized extremist group, and that act was later reconstructed in detail through forensic evidence, communications analysis, and judicial proceedings. Yet while the factual structure of the case is fixed, its interpretation continues to evolve as societies reassess the relationship between political ideology, institutional responsibility, and individual vulnerability. One of the most persistent elements in the long-term memory of the case is the tension between predictability and prevention. Marco Biagi lived a life defined by routine, professional commitment, and structured daily movement between academic and governmental responsibilities. That predictability, which once represented stability and discipline, became in retrospect a critical factor in how the attack was executed. This paradox continues to be referenced in discussions about security risk. The very normalcy of a person's life can, in certain circumstances, become the condition that allows targeted violence to occur with precision. The case therefore remains a reference point in understanding how routine behavior, when observed and analyzed by hostile actors, can be transformed into operational knowledge. At the same time, the assassination continues to be discussed within the broader historical narrative of political extremism in Italy. Although the operational capacity of Neuve Brigate Ross was dismantled through arrests, including the major breakthrough in 2003 and subsequent prosecutions, the ideological dimension of the case remains part of its historical identity. The organization's framing of its actions in ideological terms illustrates how political narratives can be used to justify violence against individuals who are not engaged in direct political competition, but are instead involved in policy development or academic analysis. In this sense, the case of Marco Biagi is frequently cited not for the specifics of its operational details alone, but for what it reveals about the expansion of perceived legitimacy in extremist ideology, where symbolic representation of state policy becomes a target in itself. The institutional response to the assassination also continues to be evaluated as part of Italy's broader evolution in counterterrorism strategy. The investigation demonstrated a multi-layered approach combining forensic science, intelligence gathering, communication analysis, and coordinated police operations. The dismantling of the network responsible for the attack was achieved not through a single breakthrough, but through sustained accumulation of evidence, culminating in arrests and the seizure of organizational materials that revealed the internal structure of the group. This method of investigation has since been studied as part of Italy's counterterrorism framework, illustrating how complex ideological networks can be disrupted through coordinated long-term efforts rather than immediate responses alone. Yet even with successful prosecution and dismantling of the organization, the case continues to raise questions about the timing and effectiveness of preventive measures. The withdrawal of police protection prior to the assassination remains one of the most frequently discussed aspects of the case in public and institutional analysis. While the decision was made based on assessments available at the time, the outcome has ensured that it remains a point of reflection in discussions about how states evaluate risk and allocate protective resources. It stands as an example of the inherent uncertainty in security decision-making, where judgments must be made without certainty about future developments, and where the consequences of those decisions may only become fully visible after irreversible events have occurred. Beyond institutional and analytical frameworks, the memory of Marco Biagi also persists in a more human dimension. His life as a scholar, educator, An advisor is often recalled alongside the circumstances of his death, creating a dual legacy shaped both by intellectual contribution and violent interruption. The naming of labor legislation after him ensures that his work remains embedded within the legal structure of the Italian state. While his biography continues to be referenced in academic contexts related to labor law and public policy. In this way, his professional identity has not been overshadowed entirely by the circumstances of his death, but rather remains intertwined with them in public consciousness. Ultimately, the enduring significance of the case lies in its intersection of law, politics, and human vulnerability. It illustrates how individuals operating within systems of knowledge and governance can become focal points in ideological conflict, not because of personal actions in the traditional political sense, but because of the influence their work exerts on policy and institutional change. The assassination of Marco Biagi remains a reminder that the boundary between intellectual contribution and political interpretation can, in moments of extremism, be distorted in ways that produce violence. Yet it also demonstrates the capacity of legal systems and state institutions to respond through investigation, accountability, and long-term structural reflection. As a historical case, it does not exist as an isolated incident frozen in time, but as part of an ongoing dialogue about how societies protect knowledge, preserve democratic processes, and respond to the presence of ideological violence within modern political life. The final image associated with the case remains unchanged. An ordinary evening in Bologna interrupted by a calculated act of violence, and the subsequent effort of a society to understand, prosecute, and learn from what occurred.